Welcome to Tangents from Coin Center. I'm Jerry Brito, Executive Director of Coin Center, and I'm very happy to have with me today Peter Van Valkenburgh, who is the Director of Research at Coin Center. And I want to thank Peter for pinch hitting kind of at the last minute because we had a guest and really unbelievable guest that we'll definitely have on the show soon.
Got to build anticipation.
I mean, you really won't believe it when you see it. We had a guest kind of have to bow out at the last minute for a completely understandable reason. And Peter was gracious enough to step in to be my guest this week.
And we're going to talk about polyunsaturated fats. That's what we're
doing. No, that's my promise to the audience that I will shut this down. That comes up. So, Peter, I thought what we would do today is maybe just have a conversation and talk about our work. Because I think a lot of folks have ideas about what Coin Center is and what we do. But I think they don't have a full picture of what it is that we do. So, I mean, this is supposed to be an interview, so I'll just start and ask you, and then I'm going to chime in too. But so what is it that we do at Coin Center?
Oh God!
Or take a step back. What is Coin Center?
You're triggering the Pavlovian reflex that I have to immediately say Coin Center is the leading nonprofit focused on the public policy issues facing cryptocurrency and decentralized network technology.
Yeah, okay. So maybe we can just start with this. So people can't imagine the number of meetings, but especially introductory meetings with regulators, congressional staffers, members of Congress that we have, where we have to start by explaining what is Coin Center. And we have, I hope it doesn't come out rote when we say it.
Well, because you're at this terrible intersection of a knowledge deficit where people, first of all, don't understand that cryptocurrencies are these things that exist in the world absent a single centralized issuer. And so it's not like we're a lobbyist that just showed up that wants to explain what our business wants to do. We want to explain this thing that is not necessarily our business. We have appointed ourselves as representatives and guardians of a technology that exists outside of any business, right? And then we're also at this intersection of a deficit of knowledge just about nonprofit technology advocacy, because even in Washington, D.C., where God knows we have every species of lobbyist on the planet represented, the nonprofit technology lobbyist with a public-facing mission is still kind of a rare breed. There's the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which was a pioneering organization back in the 90s that wanted to represent the internet, right? Before that, you had the ACLU, which is a civil liberties organization, and they got into tech stuff, but once it's about tech, it's a little bit different, right, than just regular civil liberties, because there's all this to explain. It's not just about privacy; it's about encryption.
Well, and it's what you're saying at before. It's that in DC, when a member of Congress or a regulator has somebody come to talk to them to say, "Hey, you should do this," or "Hey, just don't do anything." 99% of the time, that person coming to them is coming from a business, a company,
right,
or an association of companies, or at the very least, an organization. So like a union or a nonprofit or a church, right?
I mean, we're an organization.
We're an organization, so we don't represent
straight from the head of Vitalik Buterin in the ether.
or Satoshi, even more nebulous. So when we come to them, we're at the deficit where we have to explain not only what we are, which is a weird thing.
Yeah.
We are sort of a think tank and an advocacy center who's looking out for not any particular person or interest or company, but this thing. And this thing is
bananas.
Important,
but bananas. Yeah, it's like Niraj, I think Niraj was the first to find the image macro, the meme from Arrested Development of the Magician's Alliance with this holding a sign, "We demand to be taken seriously." And it's kind of wizard hat and stuff like that. It's like, yes, that's Coin Center.
So what? Okay, so putting aside your Pavlovian response, what would you say if you had to summarize to somebody at a party what Coin Center is?
Well, again, I have a Pavlovian response for that, which is, okay, who's the audience? And if the audience knows about open source software and the internet,
Yeah.
hopefully they know about the Electronic Frontier Foundation. And it's always interesting when we talk to people in our space, and I assume that is a base of knowledge, and then it's not there. And it makes me sad because the EFF has done such important work in the past. But if they know the EFF, gosh, I sound really judgmental now, don't I? if they know the EFF, there's a quick and easy explanation that we've both used, which is, okay, so the Electronic Frontier Foundation was started to defend not the rights of any corporation that uses the internet, like Google or Facebook or interest, but the actual interests of the internet as a technology in the world itself and individual users and their right to use that technology to better themselves, to be more private, to be more free. And we are the same, except we're not talking broadly about the whole internet. We're talking about this new specific unowned shared resource, which is an open blockchain network. And then if I'm talking to an open blockchain network person, hopefully that's relatively easy to understand, although there's certainly like centralized blockchains and decentralized blockchains. And we're talking about open, which is open source software and proof of work consensus or proof of stake consensus. And if you're not talking to an open blockchain person, then you have to explain what is Bitcoin, right? And you have to explain why this thing is a public good and a shared resource and not a corporation. But yeah,
it's yeah. So that's right. Assuming that people listening to this know what Bitcoin is and what open source is and how all that works, I would just say that what Coin Center is basically the next best thing to having. We're basically advocates for the technology before government, right? And when I say advocates, we're not advocating for the tech as in, hey, government, you should use it, or you should,
we need a blockchain to track the Veterans Affairs records.
Yeah,
yes.
We're not saying that. We're not saying you should do USAID and Bitcoin. We're not saying you should. So we're not that kind of advocate. And we also don't go around necessarily advocating for its adoption, right? We think the public should use this, and you should. What we're advocating for is the freedom for people to write and publish and use all of the software and to come together and assemble into these networks. And so whenever, and so a lot of that is educating people about what the heck this thing is when, people in government inevitably come up against it. Not that they're against it, but that they basically bump into it in their work. They're like, what is this thing? We're like, oh, we can explain, and we're probably going to get a better explanation from us than you might from somebody else. And if anybody has any wrong idea, we try to put it right, et cetera. And yeah, how does that strike you?
Yeah, so that's the education component. And, this is where the metaphor or the comparison to the Electronic Frontier Foundation breaks down a little bit, that the EFF does have great educational materials about the internet that were probably extremely useful back in the 90s when people would say things like, what is internet anyway? But the EFF has mostly made a deserved name for itself with impact litigation, right. Defending people who were, say, running a server, and the FBI broke into their house because they were relaying messages, some of which might have been criminal. And the EFF says, no, this person's just part of a network. They're not actually the speaker of this illegal material or what have you. So we don't focus on impact litigation. We focus on, can we fix the policy landscape so that we don't come to a point where we need to have litigation, so that maybe policymakers, when they're bumping into this thing, like you said, don't end up against this thing. I've got an ambulance passing my house right now.
That's travails of living in DC.
The joys of Columbia Heights.
Yeah, so I would say we don't do impact litigation yet, and hopefully we never will have to. but we might need to, and so it's not outside of our the scope of the work that we could do. But yeah, I think we want to catch laws that someday might have to be challenged before they become law, so we don't have to challenge them.
And so that's the other part. Like what you described is the education part. Like, let's hope that people understand Bitcoin before they try and make policy that changes attempts to change Bitcoin or regulate people using Bitcoin.
And by the way, Bitcoin's a stand-in for all cryptocurrency, but yes.
Open source, open blockchain network. And then the second part of our three-part plan, which is education, policy, research, and advocacy, as we always say, Pavlovian reflex is coming back, is policy research, which is we can, because we are from a legal background or policy background and have learned about these technologies, spot all the places where existing laws are going to necessarily run up against the technology. And so whether that's anti-money laundering laws that apply to financial institutions, whether that's securities laws that apply to the issuers of things that are deemed securities under our system, or whether that's things like consumer protection, like who needs to be licensed to transfer money for other people. It becomes clear once you, and Jerry, you had this experience probably earlier than anyone else, because you wrote Bitcoin, a primer for policymakers, which was like one of the first, it was probably most people's first exposure to Bitcoin in Washington, D.C. But you had this moment where you said, oh, wait, there's all these laws that potentially could be interpreted as governing or having an effect on people using these technologies. And there are no established answers to how those laws will necessarily apply or not apply to the technology. So the policy research component is sort of this long project that started with your primer for policymakers, which answered some early, very important basic questions, all the way up to things like commodities derivatives laws for an underlying asset that is a commodity, but there's a futures contract that's a decentralized smart contract built on top of it to predict the future price in order to create a stable asset. Is that a Is that a swap? Is that a commodity? Is it trading? Perhaps illegally on a decentralized network? What is going on here? And how will you, if you are, say, the CFTC, going to enforce policy here? So it's this perspective on, okay, there's X number of laws out there that could be applied. Can we find a way to apply them and have policymakers meet their policy goals within reason, while still preserving the freedom to innovate, the freedom to build these important technologies, because we do believe in them?
Yeah, and first I'd be remiss to say if I didn't say, so I co-authored that primer with Andrea O'Sullivan, who is now, we're very happy, a visiting fellow at Coin Center. It's a weird thing where once you really understand the technology and you have this policy background, you're like, wait a minute, this implicates all these laws, and you look at what the conversation is, especially back in like 2011, and people were talking about all kinds of nonsense. Like people were talking about how, well, Bitcoin's clearly illegal because only Congress has the power to coin money. And it's like, no, this has nothing to do with that, but you're missing.
There's probably still people listening to this podcast who think that might be the case.
That might be the case.
I'd love to know why.
But the funny thing is that this still happens to us, where we still spot where the gaps are between where the tech is and where it's going and what the law is. We spot those gaps usually with like 6 to 12 months lead time before, hopefully nobody's listening to this, but before anybody in government figures out that gap exists, or at least
usually there's like one person in government who's figuring it out alongside us, and we're like racing to get them the information they need to make good choices. It's not conspiratorial. It's not trying to feed them misinformation, because that's never going to work. You'll lose your credibility, and you won't be able to play an iterated game with government where you help them work to get better policy. So it's like, and that's the best part of the job. That and I think you and the rest of the Coin Center team are just good people who are fun to hang out with. But the best part of the job is that even I was telling Jerry before we started the podcast that like I'm a little drained because I was just on this longer call, and I won't say who the call was with or anything, but it was another one of these meetings where it went an hour long. And as the conversation went forward, there were people on the call who were realizing the full extent to which this technology completely changes the regulatory landscape as far as what can and cannot be easily enforced.
We can say that these are people in government who are having that realization.
Yeah. And so this is what we're 5.5 years in. And this is still a not infrequent occurrence where you have this great call where people's minds are being blown. And it's fun. We were also talking about how this discussion was happening in the DeFi context where people's minds are being blown, but a lot of it's for like yams and things that don't seem great. So that's the disappointing side, is it's like, it's fun to have these conversations, but at the end of the day, like if you'd asked me 5 years ago, like how much tangible difference in the world will this tech make? And then you told me what we know today, that there'll be like an ICO boom, which will just be basically mostly illegal crowdfunding and securities issuance. And then there'll be a DeFi boom, which will be mostly like pump and dump, being Ponzi schemes used to encourage people to participate in weird derivatives contracts in a decentralized way. I'd be kind of disappointed.
Yeah.
But it's freedom, man.
That's the thing, is that, these tools are tools and people can use them for good stuff and bad stuff, right? And there's some pretty good stuff that's happening too.
That's true.
I would
and just so that nobody thinks that I'm like turning sour on the whole project, I will add that like the most important thing is that there's a viable technology for moving money that doesn't rely on a centralized intermediary in case people ever need that. And there are parts of the world where people need that right now. And the US could very easily become a place where people need that as well. And so this is still the most important thing. It's just a little strange to me what people do with all of this tech when it's not playing that important role as insurance against tyranny.
But Peter, now I'm having a Pavlovian response. When, you've been asked this question testifying before Congress, as I have, where we've been asked, what is this good for? Why? And you know what the answer to that question is, which is that, look, it's a tool. And if you don't have the freedom to use it, what you're going to guarantee is that there's no innovation. So anyhow.
Yeah. And the people always tell the story. I think it's probably Mark Andreessen who's the first to bring this up. And so I'm probably cribbing from him that like Sergey Brin and Larry Page built like the 6th lousy search engine. Mm-hmm. And there was just this like field of terrible tech that didn't really deliver. Like you just get terrible results if you searched for like
investing in a search engine at that point was the stupidest thing.
Yeah. And it was usually driven by like, who pays us the most to have top listings? So it was just a crappy version of the Yellow Pages, and they cracked it. And then Google really did manifestly improve the ability to find information globally to the point where we just incredibly take that for granted today. So we're probably still on like the 4th or 5th crappy search engine when it comes to a lot of blockchain type projects. And maybe the next one will be more exciting from an innovation standpoint. But the point, as you were saying, is innovation.
Yes.
Innovation is this cycle that has lousy ideas that don't work and then one that does.
And not just lousy ideas, but the technology will be abused always by bad actors, right? Like what were the killer apps of the early internet? It was pornography and gambling, and email was overrun by spam. And, we can't have nice things. We know this. But eventually, you still have to fight for the right to. Anyhow, moving on from the therapy portion, what I would say is just to put a point on the research part, which is that once we spot these gaps, we know regulators are going to probably want to fill these gaps. And so what we do, and what you do especially, is we developed a policy thinking about, well, look, number one, do you really need to fill this gap? Because a lot of times maybe you don't, or maybe it's unconstitutional for you to fill this gap. So let's just maybe have a refresher on that. But if you are going to fill this gap, here is how you might want to think about doing it so that you can meet your end, whether that's consumer protection or whatever it is, while preserving the freedom to innovate. And a lot of the work that we do is developing that policy thinking, putting it out in reports, and making it available. And then the last thing we do is advocacy, which we kind of explained. We're not advocating for any particular organized interest. We're just advocating for freedom and for policies that will preserve that freedom. And advocacy is also known as lobbying.
Right. I was going to say it's kind of a euphemism, right?
Yeah. Well, yes. So here's what I think the difference is. I think advocacy is a broader term, because typically when people say they're lobbying, they want a law changed.
Right.
And I would say the majority of the time, we're not advocating or lobbying for any particular law to change. We just kind of, a lot of the times, just want things to
stay the same.
Which is kind of weird. There's sometimes we definitely want, like with a de minimis tax exemption, we have a bill that we would like to see that passed very proactively. But that's a...
No, I guess advocacy being a broader term, part of what we do is advocate to our larger constituency of people interested in decentralized technologies that they shouldn't themselves go and advocate for a change to policy, because policies aren't that bad. And be careful what you wish for, because if you ask for a change, you could get something much, much worse.
Yeah.
But we look kind of like bootlickers then, as they say.
And it's funny. I think people don't realize how good they have it. I think they focus on sort of the margins where there is a lot of gray area that's really burdensome to businesses. And naturally, especially if you're an entrepreneur, you're going to focus on that. But things are pretty good.
I mean, well, one thing that's interesting that I've been thinking about lately is, so the main thing these technologies do is lower costs to engage in a lot of activities, some of which were regulated activities before. And so more people are going to try and do those things because the barriers to entry, just from a technical or economic standpoint, are low. Like, it used to be hard to place an ad for equity in your new startup, I guess, amongst the general people, and get people to actually give you money in exchange for equity, right? But it's extremely easy to fork a cryptocurrency or promise to fork a cryptocurrency in the future and accept payments in Bitcoin and say, in the first block of the blockchain, anyone who gives me a Bitcoin will get a Peter coin. And so the barriers to entry for securities issuance, to the extent that that pre-sale agreement is a security, and I think usually it is, the barriers to entry are now shockingly low. And so a lot of people are like, oh, cool, I have access to capital, whereas I didn't before. And that's neat. And they're not necessarily going to comply with securities laws, because they might not even know that that is securities issuance, because the barriers to entry were like, you literally press a button and it's like, raise money by selling future promise. Oh, wait, that's equity, but you didn't have a lawyer you were talking to because you were just pressing the fund fork the cryptocurrency button or something like that. And so with the barriers to entry really low, a lot of people experiment and do this. They do it in a non-compliant way. And then someone tells them, oh, by the way, we've always regulated that activity as securities issuance. And in fact, it can be a bad penalty if you didn't register. And then people say, well, wait a minute, is that fair? Is that the way people should be forced to raise money, is to go through this very Byzantine and complex and expensive process of disclosures that really favors like existing players who understand how equity markets work? And there's benefits to that, because maybe they embody the protections that we would want investors to have. But there's plenty of downsides to that. It means that, like, if you want to raise capital, you got to go to like a VC, or you got to go to the New York Stock Exchange to go public and things like that. And so then people start saying, well, like, is this whole system fair? Mm-hmm. And, oh, I could get out of the registration requirement if I only sold to accredited investors. But wait a minute, is that fair that only rich people, because that's the accreditor investor standard, or at least it has been traditionally, $1 million in net worth, not including your home, is that fair that those should be the only investors? And so all of these are just questions about general investor protection policy. They're actually not questions about tokens or blockchains or open networks. And so, whereas our core competency has always been explaining those open networks and why they're important and why they shouldn't be regulated to death, I think people who wanted to use the cost savings of those networks to do things like sell equity or raise money think that if they do it with the network, it shouldn't be regulated. And we should then go to the SEC and argue for the overthrow of the accredited investor rule or the overthrow of registration as a standard for issuers of securities. And I mean, I don't necessarily agree with either of those particular investor protection policies, but as we always say, that's a much bigger debate than, you know, how Bitcoin is or is not regulated. That's a debate about how all equity is bought and sold in this country, and how all capital formation is done in this country.
Just because you're using a token in a network to do what traditionally, and to do much easier and much more efficiently what traditionally was done, you know, through all these institutions, doesn't mean you're not regulated.
Right.
Even though it's really cool that you don't have to do all that. Yeah. That said, I think this is one reason that I've always been excited about this technology, is because as somebody who thinks that so much of economic activity in the world is overregulated, and just so much of society is overregulated, I think the fact that this is so easy to use raises the costs of enforcement for the government, which, you know, if any of our friends in government are listening, that's horrible. But the way I see it, that just means that you're going to have to triage. I mean, it just means that you're going to have to better allocate your enforcement budget, you know, in quotes, about what's truly the kind of thing, you know, that deserves regulation. And you might want to rethink some of the regulations.
Right.
Because if you can't enforce them, you might want to have to rethink the regulation.
I've definitely thought that with respect to tax, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we're not going to publish this paper, but if I had to write an ideal tax policy paper for cryptocurrency, it'd be like, you just can't. I mean, it's already hard enough to in a fair way tax things like income and returns on investment without running into problems where people can hide money and take advantage of the system. Without cryptocurrency. With cryptocurrency, it's going to get even worse because the geography of like where money is being made, where profits are located, and things like that breaks down with a global network. And so we should probably just tax nothing but land or something like that, you know? Like,
well, you could, I mean, be careful. But yes, I mean, with tax, taking the logic of crypto to its ultimate conclusion, you would imagine that you would have to switch from a VAT and capital gains system a income and capital gains system to a VAT-like, which, you know, maybe, but that's just interesting. That's just kind of the logic.
And then on the anti-money laundering, so the another area we do a lot of policy research is anti-money laundering policy, which I've chosen to consistently refer to as financial surveillance policy, because it's what it really is. It's this massive warrantless search regime for your financial data. This is another area where when people see us advocating, you know, we generally want parity with the legacy financial institutions. So, you know, Bank of America holds your money, and so therefore they are a choke point. And at that choke point, we apply surveillance. And that's the deal that we made in the 1970s when the Bank Secrecy Act passed. We said,
let's hold on. There was no deal made. This was a deal that was imposed.
I mean, unless but it was a democratically elected legislature that passed this law.
That's true.
Yeah, I mean, and maybe,
okay. Maybe.
and then the Supreme Court actually rubber stamped it and said,
okay, carry on.
Warrantless data collection, and they don't use the term data collection back then, but they said this seems like a warrantless search of people's bank records. Because banks are being told they have to collect these records and give them automatically to government without a subpoena or warrant. But the Supreme Court said, no, people willingly hand this information over to banks, and therefore they don't have a reasonable expectation of privacy over that information, and therefore the Fourth Amendment warrant requirement doesn't apply. But yeah, that was a hell of a thing back then, when you'd probably have how many banking transactions per week? Like one or two?
Less than one.
Yeah. But it's really a hell of a thing now when every item you buy on the internet is a bank transaction, which means suddenly the amount of data surveilled, because you're using credit cards, you're using electronic payment methods, which go through these BSA regulated entities, is like magnified 10 times. And then, so we're out there advocating, saying, well, we should have parity with traditional financial institutions, which means that if you're holding people's Bitcoin, just like Bank of America is holding people's money, you are reasonably construed as a choke point in the financial system. And that is the sensible, maybe, if we still agree with this whole system, place to impose surveillance obligations to prevent money laundering. And the reasonable thing for us to advocate for is parity. But the thing I also want to advocate for, kind of, and to give people credit, similar in the way that a lot of people want to advocate for the removal of the accredited investor rule or deregulation of capital formation against the SEC, I kind of want to argue that the whole Bank Secrecy Act is a bad deal. That we've handed over all of our privacy in the name of security and to stop money laundering, and that needs to change. But we can't necessarily pivot Coin Center from reasonable policy that allows Bitcoin to continue to exist to everything we want to see in the world, which might be like a real warrant requirement for all financial transactions at institutions.
Yeah. So I mean, you remember this from law school. It's called arguing in the alternative. And I think we do that. And I don't think it's inconsistent for us to say, and this is earlier I was trying to interject and say that it's not that we advocate for parity. We advocate for at least parity.
That's true.
Right? So we're saying we should be treated, or cryptocurrency should be treated no more onerously than banks. That's sort of like a red line that we're always going to be guarding.
Right.
But we can also, and we're not going to, this is not going to be our top priority, is getting the Bank Secrecy Act overturned in the courts. But we have this thinking about the legality and the constitutionality of the Bank Secrecy Act, which we believe.
Yeah.
And which, if the day came for that was necessary for us to make a challenge, we would.
And what's funny is that even though cryptocurrencies are just another way to move money, and you could imagine that existing compromises like the Bank Secrecy Act and the Supreme Court opinion in California Bankers Association versus Schultz back in the 70s might as well just continue to stand, something fundamental has changed in that I think for 30 or 40 years, the institutions that were subject to the Bank Secrecy Act just didn't care much about challenging it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because
they
had fairly little to lose. Banks, not money transmitters, just banks. And I was actually talking with Katie Hawn about this, like 2 years ago. Banks, but not money transmitters, get reimbursed for the full costs of their AML compliance program from the government. So they're not just deputized as like a hired gun for criminal investigations to spy on their customers. They're also hired and paid to spy on their customers for the government. So they had no interest in challenging this regime, and it just would make their lives difficult if they became, if they started fighting with it. And something about people starting new businesses that are BSA regulated and being cryptocurrency businesses, I mean, God knows some of those people, actually a minority, would say, screw the law, I'm just not going to comply. And I don't think that's a really dangerous strategy, because you will be persecuted no matter where you are on the earth if the anti-money laundering regulators believe that you're sticking it to them. But the people who are complying, I think, are also sort of shocked by how this was always the regime for financial institutions, because they maybe didn't know, because they don't come from the banking world. They started a crypto banking startup. They didn't start a traditional banking startup. And when they realize the depth of the privacy violations that are taking place, and I simply mean warrantless searches of private customer information, they think, well, okay, well, maybe we should start to think about how to challenge this. So it sort of suddenly, it's not like cryptocurrency radically changed the world. In fact, probably more money laundering was happening in cash pre-crypto than is happening in crypto now. So it's not like the problem got worse. It's that the people that the technology brought to the equation were suddenly more interested in questioning longstanding dogma about the role of government and privacy here. And that's cool, I think.
Yeah. Well, I can tell that you spent all morning working on a paper about the BSA.
I did.
So one thing I wanted to sort of get out that I find it's a frustration as far as public perception of CoinCenter, and maybe you can see if you have something to share, is, and maybe this is going to sound self-serving, but whatever. It's that our biggest successes, or in my mind, what I think of as our biggest successes are not laws that we got passed or regulations that went through, but laws that never got passed, never even were introduced.
Yeah.
Things that never happened, things that we avoided and that we can't talk about.
Yeah.
Isn't that funny? And how do you, yeah.
Well, it's like we have common cause then with the FBI, right?
Why
isn't it something the FBI always says is like, we're only noticed for our failures?
Right.
Probably in the wake of Waco or things like that. It's like there were so many criminal plots foiled where nobody got hurt during the process.
Right.
And we can't talk about most of those. But the one time we screw up, it's like, this is the FBI's reputation for the next 10. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we can't talk about this though, Jerry. So
no, but maybe we can talk about the process, which is really the value that we bring is we are very knowledgeable about the tech, more knowledgeable than anybody in DC, so that certainly more knowledgeable than the people who are thinking. And look, there are different degrees, as you said earlier. There's always going to be one person in an agency who knows the stuff as well as we do. That's one person. In Congress, you have members of Congress who typically don't really understand this stuff, and their staffers are very young. This is just typical of Congress. So we're going to know, we're experts. We're going to know this better, and we're going to know the tech better. We're going to know the law better. And then what we have, we're very fortunate to have working with us some real professionals, Robin Wiseman, Alex Sternhill, who
they are definitely more professional than you and I.
Yeah. So they've been working in financial services on Capitol Hill, SEC, CFTC as lobbyists for decades. And what that means is that they know everybody. They just have good personal relationships with everybody. And so put this all together. And by the way, those relationships get built because there's real value that is added. And so when that all comes together, we find out just through personal relationships that somebody's thinking about something very early on. And then they're like, you should talk to somebody who's an expert on that. And that's the value that they're bringing. And we're able to, address stuff very early on.
Yeah. Well, and I think that, so the reason why we generally can't talk about a lot of these things is because we don't want it to be embarrassing to the policymaker who proposed something bad that then we convinced them was bad. And then they decided not to do the bad policy, because we want to maintain a good relationship with that policymaker so that when they come up with good policy, we can help them down the road.
Well, and if you talk about the conversations that you have in confidence with people, you'll never have conversations in confidence again.
Right. We can talk about one law that we avoided, I think, pretty clearly, which is, when the bit license came out in New York City in 2014, lots of people, I think rightly, in the Bitcoin community thought this was the first of several bit licenses. Like every state is going to have a carbon copy of the bit license. And indeed, we thought the bit license had a lot of big problems that would be very bad if it was adopted in every state. And it was cut and paste into a bill that was introduced in California. And we popped up and said hi to the person who
so that's actually
bill.
very. So that's one. Can I just say that's one where it wasn't the personal relationships that led to this. It was really basically Google alerts that led to this, where a bill was introduced into the California Assembly, and we have alerts for this. If it says virtual currency or cryptocurrency, we know. And we look at this bill, and it was literally a copy and paste, not just of the bit license, but of the first draft of the bit license. And this had been introduced. And so we immediately, saw the assembly member. We figured out who their staffer on this was. And or Robin picked up the phone and said, "Hi, we saw you do this. You just introduced this. Great, you're getting involved in this. What are you trying to accomplish?"
Yeah.
And the good news there is that person said, "Oh, we introduced this so that people like you would come out of the woodwork."
Yeah. And I still remember one of our trips to California where Robin and I rented a car and drove from San Francisco to Sacramento. And I think we talked about wallpaper and some other things. It was a great car ride. But then, we managed to get them to change the bill.
To not just scrap that completely, but to turn it into a bill that was actually pretty good. Never passed, sadly.
And then the next step was working with the Uniform Law Commission to develop an alternative model that would say, if you're holding other people's Bitcoins, maybe you have to be licensed because you're custodial and you present a risk. But we can do this in a way that doesn't ruin your ability to operate your business by constantly having to get approval from someone like the DFS for a new line of products. And that also doesn't sweep in non-custodial activities, which is our number one goal with this licensing stuff, is to make sure that somebody running a node or miner or holding one of three keys in a multisig aren't regulated and aren't required to get a license. And the ULC has become the de facto model when states are looking to license exchanges, and the bit license has not. So there's one of the...
And that was all done in public, so...
Yeah. So we can talk about that because we're not betraying confidences.
That's right. So something else that doesn't frustrate me, but that I get a lot, and it'd be good to just talk about here, is what exactly, we kind of already talked about it, but who do we advocate for and who don't we? Like, what do we do and what don't we do? And here's what I mean by that. And maybe I love the cryptocurrency industry and our friends in the crypto industry. And indeed, a lot of our support comes from the cryptocurrency industry. About half of our support comes from cryptocurrency industry. The other half comes from individuals who care about the tech. But we don't represent the cryptocurrency industry. And I think that's something that a lot of folks don't get. That we're not trying to, we want to see the success of the cryptocurrency industry, but it's not the success of the cryptocurrency industry that we're maximizing for. It's the success of cryptocurrency networks and people's ability to use them.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, it just gets back to what we were saying in the beginning, which is sort of, sometimes I shouldn't do this because it makes me seem probably goofy and less credible, but so like we speak for the trees. We're like the Lorax. Right. So if you come from an economics background, you learn about public goods, right? And you learn about how public goods are chronically underproduced by markets because you can't internalize the benefits of what you're building. And a public good, by definition, in the economic literature, is something where you can't exclude people who use the thing, because if you could exclude, then you'd be able to find a way to charge for its usage. And one person's usage doesn't diminish somebody else's usage necessarily. It's non-rivalrous. So that, in succinctly, is exactly what Bitcoin is. it's a free and open protocol that anyone can join. Not only can anyone, join the protocol and mine blocks and send transactions and receive transactions. And this is a thing that I think should be pointed out more often. Yeah, Bitcoins are expensive. So people think like, oh, I can't get into that. I can't afford a Bitcoin. A, you can buy a fraction of a Bitcoin, which is a meme in our community. But B, just to receive a Bitcoin transaction, all you need is software, which is free. So it really is truly this free and open public good. And so like the Lorax who speaks for the forest and all the good things that the forest can provide the world, even though it's not owned by a corporation, even though it's not the forest industry, as you would say, the Bitcoin industry, it's the real heart of the thing, and it needs somebody to speak for it. And so that's Coin Center is we come in and we say, look, yeah, there are these big profitable corporations that might be building on top of it, like an exchange like Coinbase. There are people trying to take the technology and sort of privatize it for some particular end, like R3, with like building a network between banks that uses a blockchain. But the really important thing that deserves a voice in DC, because Coinbase can lobby in DC and R3 can lobby in DC, is this fundamental open source technology that you can't exclude people from. And the fact that you can't exclude people from it is what's so important about it, what's so good about it.
And it's a technology, it's a network, it's a thing, it's a forest, it's an ecosystem that would otherwise have no voice.
Right.
And we're self-appointed. We make no bones about that, but we think we're doing a pretty good job. And it should go without saying that the interests of the industry and the thing should be almost perfectly aligned.
Yeah. Which would be different than the Lorax, because I think they were taking the trees and turning them into like the weird onesies.
Ah, very good.
That's the story, right? Have you gotten Peggy the Lorax? It's like one of the best. Penny, sorry.
What did you call her?
Peggy.
Peggy.
Been watching too much Mad Men lately.
I think she's got a Dr. Seuss book, but not that one. I mostly have B is for Bitcoin and things like that.
Fair.
All right. Well, Peter, thank you very much for pinch hitting. I hope people liked it. I would encourage people to reach out, and if they have any questions, on Twitter, this is going to be on YouTube, so in the comments, let us know. If you have any questions or what you think, I'd be very curious.
Agreed.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Jerry.